I'm in Milan at the moment for the World Press Briefing ahead of the 2026 Winter Olympic Games in Milano Cortina. Now, today on the program, I want to talk about privacy issues because we're starting to see a bit of a focus across a whole different range of issues in sport with regard to privacy, and in particular, athletes and what happens to the data of athletes. Now, there's been some changes to the law or some recommendations to changes to the law in Australia. We'll explore that with Matt Jessep shortly. We're also going to speak to somebody who did an academic report on privacy and the laws in Canada, and that has prompted the Privacy Commissioner in Canada to do an investigation into WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency. Now, I'm not sure that there are issues with the World Anti-Doping Agency's privacy regulations as they stand, but it's what happens with that data once it's fed into some of its other stakeholders, national anti-doping organisations or international federations, and then how they might use very private information with regard to athletes competing around the world, gathered specifically for anti-doping investigations or anti-doping tests, but then used in other circumstances. And we see that come to the fore, which has reared its head again after the Paris Olympic Games, and in particular the boxer Imran Khalif. But I've got a whole lot of other stuff coming too. Hope you can stay tuned. Marcus Mazzucco is a lecturer at Toronto University. As a practicing lawyer who also looks at privacy issues, he took a deep dive into the personal data of athletes that is stored by WADA. And he was wondering whether athlete data collected essentially to catch doping cheats was being taken a step further and used without their authority to determine whether they qualify for sex-based eligibility events.
But I think overall, I think the concern that many athletes, scholars, human rights advocates have is that you have all these very intrusive rules set up for the anti-doping system to track athletes' whereabouts, to collect their bodily specimens, all in the spirit of regulating doping. And there's been, over time, quite a bit of, buy into that system. It's relatively accepted in sport in order to ensure clean sport and a level playing field. But where you start to use those rules and leverage the data for secondary purposes, that's where I think it becomes problematic. And in terms of the actual data flow, I think my concern has been around, I've had to kind of separate out who's doing what with the data and at what times. So when it comes to Canadian privacy law that applies to WADA, it's the data flow that's relevant is WADA's disclosure of doping control information in the database that it holds to international sport federations. So anytime those sport federations access this database for their own purposes, including to, monitor the eligibility of intersex and trans women athletes, there's a disclosure of that data from WADA to the International Sport Federation that's regulated through Canada privacy laws. But then once those international sport federations have the data, they can go off and use and disclose it for their own purposes. And that subsequent use and disclosure falls outside of Canadian privacy laws and is subject to other privacy laws, including the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. So my research looked at the application of both laws, the Canadian privacy law and the European Union's privacy law.
So one of the big things has been, as you identified, it's not in the prosecution of anti-doping so much, but the way it's now being used to determine whether somebody qualifies under the rules of sport, and each sport might have a different set of rules with regard to trans and DSD athletes. For some of these athletes, and I've spoken to a few of them, they had no idea they had or were classified as DSD and what that meant, and the impact on their lives, leading to, suicide attempts in some instances. And I wonder about that, and whether or who controls that? Like, what law does it sit under? Are the rules of sport the laws of sport? Sport argues for its autonomy all the time. Are they allowed to prosecute that because that's what their rules say? Or do they come under some other system human rights law? And again, every country has a different set of standards.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a great point. Like the sports system and these international sport organizations like to claim their autonomy from national legal systems, but they are subject to national laws because they are situated somewhere and they carry out their actions or activities somewhere. So they are subject to national law. It's just that historically, those laws have not been always enforced against sport organizations. And I think privacy law or data protection law is a unique area because it has been underutilized to question and challenge the practices of sport organizations. So I think the time is right to start to use them and challenge what's happening.
We've seen some of these cases drag on for many years, and this is where sometimes the conflict in sport happens with the law of the land, and laws of the land are not written with sport in mind because it's such a small subset of what goes on. And so I wonder, you've no doubt heard as many arguments as I have about enforcing these rules of sport in the name of fairness, and how you have, categories that are fair and people are not being put at unfair disadvantages because of differences in sexual development.
Right. And that certainly has been the policy rationale advanced to justify these rules. But some of that is kind of irrelevant when it comes to data protection laws, right? So one aspect of data protection laws that I focus on in my research is this principle of lawfulness. And that's the idea that an organization cannot collect, use, and disclose personal information without having a valid legal basis to do so. And that valid legal basis can differ depending on which law applies. But in Canada, for example, you need to have the explicit consent of the athlete in this case, and also the purpose of the collection, use, or disclosure of the information has to be appropriate. So, so one of the things I looked at in my research was whether a disclosure by WADA to an international sport federation of this data for a sex testing purpose would be considered appropriate. And I reached the conclusion that it would not be, and therefore it would be illegal under Canadian privacy law.
Matt Jessep is a sports law expert from Game Legal. His organisation was commissioned to look at exactly this issue. So talking of potential risks, what would you recommend to governing bodies and even media organisations or anybody else involved in this environment about what they need to guard against should those privacy laws be, or when those privacy laws are tightened in Australia?
Well, I think step one would be to understand, should the reforms pass through Parliament, to understand what that means for the current practices. And within the context of Australian sport, we have that, we have that federated structure where the national sporting organisation will govern the sport throughout Australia, and then there'll be state sporting organisations underneath them. So it creates in some cases, a layer of governance that needs to be managed. So I guess in that case, it'd be not just understanding the reforms, but then doing an audit, carrying out an audit of potential exposures. And certainly if the reforms in relation to consent and the requirement for informed consent pass through Parliament, then that would require a change of process. So every athlete, whenever they're asked if their phone number can be shared, for example, that would have to be a far lengthier discussion potentially than what's taking place. So I guess that audit would be step one. But I think in terms of which organisations are most in need of compliance, it would be the media organisation, it would be the sporting organisation, the stakeholder group that is potentially getting or facing the impact from this potential risk and exposure is the athlete. So I think it would really take an informed athlete group to stand up and say, well, not only is this now a requirement, but but we're really pushing for this as well. We're pushing through this through our player associations, or for Olympic sports, potentially through athlete commissions and that sort of thing. So I think in terms of the groups that are exposed, it may need that push from the athlete collectively to really get this through.
And I know we've seen it in, what happens to private data in the AFL. We've seen Adam Goods, part of a group saying, hang on a second, we own that data. That's our personal stuff that we're handing over here. Where's it ending up? And, how's it being used when it ends up in the hands of betting agencies or illegal betting companies? And then, as I say, this whole thing with WADA, and I think I saw this really play out at the Paris Olympic Games with Iman Khalif and the Algerian boxer. And we still don't know the truth of that. We've had rumours from all sorts of different interested parties about what the actual situation is. But when you've got an athlete who signs up and says, yep, I'm putting myself forward for anti-doping, their data goes away to be tested, and suddenly they may be informed, and I'm not saying this is the case with Iman Khalif, the boxer, but it seems pretty likely. People get information back and they go, hey, I don't think you knew this, but you're DSD. You're not the female you thought you were. And suddenly people's lives are turned upside down. And who determines that? Is that a sports body that is able to determine that or leak that to the press? Or say that somebody who legally was born female, spent their whole lives as female, is not a female. It's a complex kind of area, isn't it?
We need to understand those cases at the individual level. And if there has been a leak at that individual level that impacts that individual, then that needs to play out through those processes available to that individual, which is unfortunate, because then it distracts from that athlete's main purpose of training and competing. But that would need to play out through whatever grievance process is seeking some sort of remedy that they may seek. But then that should be used to inform those sporting organisations in relation to future conduct. And it can be confusing for those sporting organisations if they're facing this for the first time, if they're not equipped or resourced to consider these discussions. But unfortunately, again, the stakeholder group that wears the impact of that is the athlete.
Yeah, athletes are always at the bottom of the pile in that regard. One thing I do know for sure is that lawyers are just going to get more and more work out of sport. So you guys are in the prime position.
Well, yeah, and I think, in terms of athletes being at the bottom of the pile, there are cases around the world. If we look at the professional sports in North America, which have very strong player associations, who deal with questions around doping outside of the WADA framework and deal with it in what's been described as a significantly more athlete-friendly way, and look at it as potentially a substance abuse issue in the first instance, rather than jumping straight to the cheating allegation. There are different ways to approach how athletes are treated and where they sit within that consideration framework. So hopefully, we're sitting within a WADA framework now under the WADA code from 2021, which did bring about significantly more athlete-friendly approaches to anti-doping rule violations. But there's still concerns around breaches of human rights in relation to whereabouts failures. And then this recent this complaint that's been raised in Canada, which the Canadian Information Privacy Commissioner is looking into, with WADA being based in Montreal, being subject to Canadian law. So there's perhaps more room for reform within the WADA world as well. So while certainly lawyers should be involved, I think it's ultimately up to the athlete and the athlete associations and athlete unions to really see this as an important issue, and I'm sure they all do, and I'm sure they're dealing with it appropriately. But hopefully it is being prioritised here within Australia. And this example that we look at in the report through commissioned through Blinder is just one case where athlete rights are potentially being not considered or at worst being ignored.
Mm. So anyone who wants to see the report can go to blinderhq.com and check it out there. Have you got it on your website?
I'm really bad at my website. I perhaps should load it up, but
No, that's fine. Blinder HQ, people can remember.
Blinder HQ is the place to go. Yeah, awesome.
Algerian boxer Iman Khalif has taken out several lawsuits against people for spreading fake news about her, and even in the last couple of weeks we've seen a doctored image of her go viral once again. Now, what can be done about these viral images? It's something that has concerned news agencies right around the world. I'm talking about agencies like AFP, AP and Reuters, who are concerned that images that they take may then be doctored later on, but people will end up suing them for spreading these fake photos. But this is something that photographic equipment makers have been looking very carefully at, and it looks like progress has been made. The incredible Nick Didlick, photographic and technology expert and a comrade in crime,
Right.
Shouldn't say that,
Well,
fellow IOC Young Reporter mentor.
Yeah, we've committed crimes in many countries, haven't we?
Careful,
Yeah.
people will take that seriously. It's
think-
not meant seriously. Nick, you were mentioning you've been doing a lot of work with technology in photographic equipment. We know that one of the biggest issues confronting news especially is fake news.
Right.
But there's some camera gear that is doing
Right.
a remarkable job in the future.
And especially in photojournalism, one of the things is what is fake imagery and how can we prove it's not fake? And so in the, I do a lot of consulting with companies like Sony, Nikon, and Canon, but mostly Sony, and making it so that a user can put data into his photograph and make sure it's verified all the way throughout the chain. So if somebody says, well, that's a fake photo, we can go back through the chain and actually see the original photo as it was taken by that camera. And it's almost like having a birth certificate. So when the picture's taken, it actually embeds all this data and it carries it through the chain.
It's interesting you mention birth certificate because what I'm going to do is raise here an example that people might be able to kind of use in their mind to interrogate this issue. Iman Khalif, a boxer, an Algerian boxer at the Paris Olympic Games. There's been a photo that's been doing the rounds recently which shows her face on a male body standing in a male swimsuit. And now we know all of this is all around accusations that she's not female when in fact her birth certificate says she's female, her passport says she's female, she's been raised as a female. There's a whole lot of other issues we can go into there regarding DSD. But that photo with this technology, how would you use that?
Right. Well, so we could actually look at that photo and go back in its history and see what the original photo would look like. And so you would see the original photo of her, obviously with her real body, and then you would see the fake photo that was put together. And we're really worried about this during the US elections because there was all sorts of fake imagery coming out every day, and you'd see pictures of the President-elect Trump with like a bodybuilder's thing, trying to look tough. And we saw a ton of this happen. And what the problem with it is the public believe it. I mean, they're so used to seeing photographs of when they're growing up as kids and the belief in photography just generally. That's what the biggest issue is.
Yeah, so the camera doesn't lie. In
Yeah.
fact, these days,
Yeah.
like everything else, it does.
Yeah, but the camera's lied for almost since photography was invented. I mean, there's all going back into the earliest pictures of China, and the images were put together. And so it always has had this. It's just now anybody can do it. Brand new iPhone, you could just say, take my ex-husband out of the photograph, for instance, or put somebody into the photograph. And it's done right in your phone immediately.
We're living in an unreal world.
Yeah.
And we're trying to find the realness within it.
Well, and I think trust, and especially in journalism, is the core. It's the core to all of this, right? And not only with fake news, but you see all these types of conspiracy theories growing up, and a picture to go with a conspiracy theory that then make it believable. It's actually fact.
How much is this technology going to cost? Is it going to be in everything, and can we all access it?
it hasn't been defined yet how much it's going to cost. For the user, it's not. It's going to be a small fee. It'll be something that you'll put into your camera. So your camera will already have this activated, or not activated, but it'll already be in your camera, and for a small fee, you'll activate it. And when you activate it, it'll also put your personal credentials on that photograph. So then you'll be able to look back and say, oh, Nick took that photograph 3 years ago, and follow the chain right through. So, for people that want to verify data, there'll be a larger cost than the user will see.
Yeah. And there'll be a lot of people, I imagine, that will be trying to deactivate this technology from their camera.
Well, and then you can tell, like you look at the handout pictures from the Department of Defense or even the royal family, it can be deactivated, but you'll see the chain get broken. So when it breaks, somebody's obviously doing something wrong.
Nick, I just raced here in the freezing cold in Milan. You've been in a nice warm office. Yeah. I'm sitting here in a big jacket. I'm starting to sweat, and I think my nose is about to run. Uh-huh. So we might call the interview to an end here.
Well, until next time, Tracy. Yeah. It's so pleasant to see you again.